So, welcome to this session on translation and technologies. In this module, we'll focus on the significant role that technology plays in the translator's profession, what tools exist, and how this role has developed over time. So in this video and in this session, we'll gain an insight into the different tools that exist in translation with the aid of technological tools software, and we'll also learn a little bit more of how they work. So, the Alliance of Translation and Technologies. The objectives of this session are as follows: to identify and explore the different types of technology that exist, which aid in the organization and the completion of a translator's work, and also how to develop and apply critical thinking, decision-making, and analytical skills in the interpretation and reaction towards the use of technologies for the purposes of translation. So we'll be going through these two topics today in this session. So let's see. So when you think of translation and technology, probably a lot of things come to mind. So I've placed some of the keywords on this slide to allow you to think for a moment about what these elements are, what they could be if you're not sure what they are, how they differ from each other, and where exactly they can be found and how they can be utilized. So there's a series of words here, and it might be a good idea just to think about them for a moment and also take a look at maybe how they could be different from one another. So we'll be defining in this session all these different terms, but just taking a look at some of them for a moment. So we can see CAT tool and machine translation, and right in the middle of those two we have CAT tool versus machine translation or machine translation engine. So we'll be having a look at that. We'll also be looking at translation memories that are up there as well. We'll be looking at what they are, how they function, what they look like in real life. We'll also explore the similarities and difference between glossaries and term bases. So that's down at the bottom left-hand corner. We've glossary, term base, and what the two differences are there also. We'll also be taking a look briefly at desktop publishing, what that means, where it comes into play in the role of a translator, and why it's important to have knowledge about it. And also with regards to video remote interpreting and just remote interpreting in general, and why that might be important just to briefly mention in this session here today. So let's start off. I guess the best place to start off with is looking at CAT tools, this software that essentially binds everything together when it comes to talking about translation and technology. So I don't have it mentioned on this slide, but CAT tool refers to computer assisted translation, and it's a type of software that can be either downloaded to your computer in the form of an application, or it can be used through internet browsers just by going through Internet Explorer or going onto Google Chrome or any of the different internet browsers that exist. This software then allows you to store and manage translation and translation projects. So depending on the scale of the work you're doing, it could be just one translation, or you could work for an LSP, and you may have to use this tool to manage all of the tasks you do on a day-to-day basis with regards to your translation projects. So it's important to mention that a CAT tool does not actually translate for you. It translates nothing at all, but provides you with a very productive environment to translate in. So it allows you to incorporate a series of language assets, and we'll talk about what they are in a moment. You can incorporate these language assets into the task of translation, and a CAT tool essentially takes care of the monotonous tasks when we talk about translation, which in turn then allows you to focus on more important things when it comes to this task. So you might be wondering, what are these monotonous tasks when it comes to translation? Is it not just part of the translation task? Well, these are things like, how can I ensure that I translate the same term consistently through a text? How can I make sure that I am formatting the text in a right way? So when it comes to spacing, font size, italics, capitalization, all of these different things that we really take for granted. Another monotonous task could be, is there any way that I can save time, not having to translate the same term over and over again? So a CAT tool can help you economize your translation time through the use of technology. So these are all the monotonous tasks that CAT tools take care of, allowing for consistency and accuracy just being two of the things that you can benefit through by using them. So these tasks are completed through feeding your CAT tool, we like to call it. So you're feeding your cat so that it works efficiently and economically. And the feed or the food you give to this CAT tool is in the form of language assets that we talked about earlier on. So these are things like glossaries, machine translations, translation memories, and these all allow for a smooth workflow. They were at the start of our presentation, so we'll have a look at what they are in detail in a few moments. But when you complete projects on a CAT tool, you can also save newly generated language assets. So it's not just that you're giving food to the CAT tool, it also generates all these language assets that you can use over and over again. So it's like recyclable language. So we'll be discussing them a little later on, so it might be a good idea to come back to the slide once we've looked at them individually so that you can understand what they are and how they work in a more holistic manner. So it can't be denied that a CAT tool is a valuable asset to have as an LSP or even as a freelance translator. So an LSP would be a language service provider. These would be the different companies that work on a larger scale perhaps than a freelancer. To carry out different language service products or services. But it can also help as a freelance translator, cuts the time, takes you to complete work or to complete a translation project and ensures that the client is receiving good quality work. Okay, so that's our CAT tool, probably the most important one. Next is machine translation. So to quickly help you in understanding what this is, I want you to think of Google Translate. I want you to think about what you need to do to be able to use Google Translate and how it works, what it looks like, and possibly even some of the issues that you think you might come across when using Google Translate, or even some of the strengths that it might have. So think about all of that. Essentially, that is what a machine translation is, or a machine translation engine rather. These are also referred to as MTs for short. So machine translation is also a software that allows you to receive an automated translation of text in a target language. So you insert it in what we call a source language and you receive an end product in a target language. So when it comes to machine translation, the translator does not have a real active role other than inputting the source message. That's all you do. The machine does the rest. You get the output and you do with it as you please. So therefore, it is safe to say that machine translation lacks the human factor that's essential in translation. And this is usually what leads to a series of complications and arguments when it comes to using translation technology. A lot of people argue that the human factor isn't present. Some people say that a machine translation could even be compared to a robot. And just like a robot, machine translation lacks the sensitivity of language and linguistic elements such as syntax, semantics, morphology, amongst others. So the big question here is, how do I overcome this lack of sensitivity? So the quality of a machine translation can be determined by what the machine translation is fed. Again, we're talking about the food of the CAT tool, the food of the machine translation. So before solving the problems of machine translation, I suppose it's important to know what it contains and what the translator needs to make sure of when using this type of tool. So a machine translation feeds off previous translations. So all of this source language has essentially been stored, and the bigger the quantity of language stored, the larger the machine translation tool is to allow you to use language in different ways and allows you to be more sensitive to context more than anything. So This might help in understanding why Google Translate has improved throughout the years. So many people, when they started using Google Translate, it was criticized a lot for being inadequate and for being very, very literal in its translations. And this could essentially be due to the fact that it hadn't been fed enough language to be able to differentiate between contexts. And that's essential when it comes to using machine translation. So this can overcome a well-fed and energized machine translation tool through the input of good translation memories. So we'll talk about those in a minute, what a translation memory is. So being able to use machine translation is usually a tool that's incorporated in a CAT tool. So when you're using your project in a CAT tool, it might offer you this option of translating all of the content through the use of a machine translation. So we mentioned already, CAT tools don't actually translate, they just help you manage projects, incorporating all these language assets that can help you do that at a quicker pace. So when you're using MT, what you have inserted can be considered a block of text that has been fed to the MT and then can be converted and saved as a linguistic element in a CAT tool, or just, you know, in a normal search engine, just like Google Translate. So that's machine translation. So kind of just to sum up, CAT tools and machine translation, what's the difference, what's similarities? Well, they appear to be the same thing, but they're not. So they're both softwares, that's correct. However, a CAT tool provides me with a platform to carry out my translation, and it facilitates my work through the incorporation of different tools that will make my job quicker. It can answer the question of where I can translate using technology, whereas machine translation can be considered the who, when we ask who it is that actually carries out the translation when I use technology. So technology can be useful, and translation can be carried out through machine translation. Where I can do that is I can do it on a search engine, I can do it on a CAT tool. So there's the similarities and differences between these two that are usually confused from time to time. So another task I think that's important to mention is the task of post-editing. So post-editing is a related task. So it's not translating, but rather a task that we can refer to when talking about using technology to aid in the completion of translation projects. So as I mentioned previously, using machine translation eliminates the role of the translator. And this at time can cause issues when it comes to the sensitivity of a text and the lack of the human factor. So even if I have a good quality food given to my machine translation, and that food, remember we call that translation memories, it's still essential that a human intervenes to check that the translation suggested by the machine translation is a good one. So the minute in which I do something with the target text that comes out of Google Translate, let's say, for example, that task is called post-editing. It's kind of like fixing a document to make sure that the correct translations are there. So post-editing is a task that you do to a machine translation, and it can also be done in a CAT tool. So let's imagine you have a project in a CAT tool, you input your document, you use machine translation to do the translation. Then after, in your CAT tool, you're going to need someone to take a look at that translation. And that person is called a post-editor. The task they do is called post-editing. Okay, that's another word that we had there on the screen, important to mention. Now, the one I've been talking about a little bit as well is a translation memory, a TM, as they're referred to. So we've referred to it a lot already, but it's time now to put it into context. So what is a translation memory? As I previously mentioned, this is what feeds our machine translation. We can only use a machine translation, such as Google Translate, if previous translations have been saved. So it's essentially a database where we store bilingual translations. So we store side by side two different entries, one entry, one output, let's say, in two different languages stored side by side. So when we use a CAT tool to carry out a project, once we've completed the project, it then says your project now can be downloaded as a Word document, you can download it as a PDF, you can download the source file, which is, let's say, the English file. You can download the translation. Let's say the translation is German. You can download that file, or you can essentially download a translation memory, which is the two files combined together side by side with their corresponding elements, sentences, whatever it is that it is. It could be headings, sentences, words, anything, all put together. So the software essentially in our CAT tool essentially restructures the text. We insert it along with the translation decisions we made. It then aligns them into tables. So we can retrieve this translation memory for future use. We can input it into a different software. We can just have it on our computer. We can add it to that client that has lots of other translations, make it all one translation memory, or have them as all individual translation memories. So it's very, very beneficial for future use. So I guess the main takeaway here is that creating and using TMs are of great benefit to all those involved as they provide great consistency. So when you work on a project that has an appropriate and relevant translation memory attached, we'll come back to that point in a minute of appropriacy. So, but if you apply appropriate TM to a project you're working on, you'll find that your document starts to fill up automatically with these repeated terms, and you'll also be offered prompts of translation when the translation found in your translation memory is similar, but perhaps not exactly the same. So just going back to appropriacy, well, if I have a translation memory on medical tools, for example, let's imagine I just did a translation on medical tools, carried it out, and I saved a translation memory at the end. Let's say I have that. And now I'm doing a project for the same client, and I say, well, I already have a translation memory for them, so why don't I use it? But let's imagine that project is on now legal procedures. So my translation memory is on medical tools and my new translation is on legal procedures. Well, there's not much common elements there. So in this case, if I insert my translation memory, I'm probably not going to see a lot of entries being automatically put into my translation project this time around for legal procedures. So it's important to really think about how you're going to store your translation memories. Are you going to store them by client? Are you going to store them by topic? And all of this. So I guess the managing as well and storing of translation memories are also of great importance to consider. So that's kind of what they are, but what do they look like? Well, I previously mentioned that once we complete a project in our CAT tool, it's saved as a translation memory. But to do this, the CAT tool essentially restructures the text we inserted and aligns them into tables, just like I said. So this table that I'm talking about consists of two different elements. It contains segments and units. And we'll take a look at what they look like just in a second, but let's kind of just think about what they are first before we go looking at them in context. So a translation segment of a source, let's say, of a source text can be a phrase, a whole paragraph. It can be a heading. It can be a language element, just like an adjective, let's say, that we find within a row of our translation memory. So we said, remember, our translation memory is a table. Let's think of our tables that contain rows and columns. Each row will have a segment in them. So the segment is the smallest unit of text that can be understood on its own. So I should be able to read that segment and not need any other information to be able to understand what I'm referring to. So it might be very difficult to understand what that is. So I'll take a look at it in a second with you, but we're missing the other part, the unit. So the translation unit is also in the table of a translation memory. And this then consists of corresponding segments. So we said a translation segment is just one part of text that can be understood on its own. And a unit is going to be that segment with its bilingual corresponding language. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the examples. What do they actually look like? So here I have in my table, in my slide rather, I have example 1 and example 2. So if we take a look at example 1, we'll see that we have a very small part of a table. We have 2 columns, EN representing English, ES representing Spanish. And I have 2 rows. The 2 rows then refer to 2 different either translation segments or translation units. So if you take a look at my mouse right now, if I consider the rows that contain both columns, so I'm saying individual roles, roles individuales, the 2 of these together would be what we call a translation unit. One source text, one translation corresponding together to form a unit. But if I want to just look at one part of that, and I just want to take a look at roles individuales, that part there is what we call a segment. The bit underneath los propietarios de animales incluidos, etc., that part here is what we would consider to be a segment also. But if I match this segment with its corresponding source text, I'm now talking about a unit of translation. So I would have done my translation in my CAT tool, and I'm finished now, and I download the translation memory, and it's going to look like this, but it's obviously going to have a lot more rows. It's only going to have 2 columns because I did one project in one language. But what about if I had 5 languages running for this project? I had Spanish, German, French, Arabic, and Bengali, for example. Let's imagine those were my languages. I would have more rows. So that would just depend on my project. And if we take a look down at the bottom here at example 2, this is essentially a CAT tool. This is me doing my project, not finished yet. And you can see that there's a lot of different things here. So we have an automated prompt. So if you see here in orange, I have the word form, and I want to translate that now, and I'm not really sure. So the translation, the machine translation I used, put in this suggestion. So now I want to have a look and see, is it correct? I need to use the human factor now. So if you see here, they give me an automated prompt. So they say form is formulario. But they want us to check if that's actually the case. Is the context correct to be able to say it's formulario and it's not something else? It's not the verb formar, for example. So they give us all these options here on the side. So this would have been prompts. And where do I get the prompts? I get them from previous translation memories. What would that be? Would be me doing a project in this language before, or it might be what my machine translation suggests, because that has lots of different projects that it would have incorporated into it. So if you see also here, it says translation, and there's no tick there yet, so it's not confirmed. This is the task of post-editing that we talked about. So a post-editor comes into a project after machine translation has been applied, and it uses the human factor to be able to be sensitive towards cultural and contextual information in a translation. So that's just 2 examples of what these might look like in reality. So here we have a translation memory, and here we have a CAT tool interface, just for you to get an idea of what that is. Okay, so moving on. The next thing that's up is a term base. So this one is sometimes confused with dictionaries. So I've added up here in the title, are they dictionaries? Well, let's see. So as visible in the name, if we break it down, a term base is a combination of the words terminology and database. And this is essentially what it is. It's a database of terminology that technology helps us to both create and utilize in a project. So I can create it before I enter a project, I can create it while I'm doing a project, and I can also implement it into my project, which is probably the most important part. So for those who don't work in the field of translation, they could probably compare this to dictionaries and say, well, dictionaries are the same thing. If I want to know what coche means, can't I just look it up in my dictionary and it'll tell me exactly what it is? That's not the case in translation. If not, we'd just call it a dictionary, right? So they serve a similar purpose, but they're quite distinct. So these are databases of terminology that are specific to particular projects. So if you think about it, working with one client could be completely different to working with another. We all have our own preferences when it comes to using language, but sometimes particular clients, businesses want us to use particular phrases and words to refer to particular things. So it's important to have something like this to help you out. So in a term base, you can store linguistic units, we call them. So they can take the form of single words, like coche. They could take the form of phrases like ¿qué tal? Instead of ¿cómo estás? Or expressions. So they can be just left there alone. They can be used for translation, or they can be used for reference when it comes to carrying out a project. But essentially, it allows the linguist to add comments on how a term should be treated. So if I have a term that I should never translate, for example, it should always appear the same way. Well, that'll be in my term base. I can have the term that I suggest to be used. I can also add a definition, and I can also add a rule or a note for the translator in a way that it should be always translated, or even if we think about it, we could add a phrase and say, please never translate it this way, for example. Okay. Similar to a translation memory, we can use it again. If we want to, we can work on it. It allows us to increase our productivity and, more importantly, accuracy, consistency. And it also helps us to avoid mistakes, which I guess is the most important part. Ensuring that we have uniformity of terminology, which at the end of the day is essential to ensuring a particular style of translation. So moving on to our last one here. Video remote interpreting. So this is the last one I'm going to talk about, and I just have it here in one very brief slide because essentially it's not translation, but it is a language service, and we are talking about technology, so I guess it fits in well and should be referred to. So the purpose of our session is essentially to talk about the translation impact with technology, but this is definitely something that technology has helped us to advance on. So it's a type of software, VRI, video remote interpreting, the type of software. It could be compared to that of video conferencing, but it's also used for the provision of services. So if we think about, let's say, a Hispanic speaker entering a hospital in the United States. How can they ensure that they are provided a service, even if they don't speak the language that that region speaks, or the hospital, their doctor, healthcare provider speaks? Video remote interpreting allows us to do that. If we're having an international conference, we could also have a translator an interpreter rather, located in a remote area, translating for, interpreting for these people. So this is a service, I guess, that is enhanced by the use of technology, and only possible through the use of technology. So today's session really was to go through those different tools that technology has allowed the translation profession to advance in. So I'm just going to go back to that slide again. What comes to mind when we think of translation, technology and translation, with all of these things, machine translation, translation memories, glossaries? We didn't really refer to that one, but I suppose a glossary is kind of more similar to a dictionary, whereas a term base would allow us to incorporate rules. We have things like CAT tools, which is like the environment where we can let all these technological tools work in. We also have desktop publishing, and I didn't really refer to that, but we'll talk about it quickly. In a CAT tool, if I insert an Excel file, how can I make sure that when I finish the translation, I'm going to get it back in an Excel file? So it's a type of software that lets you work with formatting. So how can I make sure that I'll have all the headings in the same places? How can I make sure that all my bold text in the file I put into the CAT tool will come out in the same way? This is a tool that's incorporated into desktop publishing, into a CAT tool. So that one, we looked at all of these here today, and all of these are very, very important when it comes to using technology and being involved in the translation field that is just at this moment really influenced by technology. So I hope you enjoyed it, and As I said, go back, go forward and back as you wish, as many of these terms are intertwined and relatable on different contexts. So I hope you enjoyed today's session. Thank you very much.